Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Coffee Chat with CastleHill. Today, I'm joined by two superstars who are going to help me talk a little bit about diversity and discussion around how third party risk management incorporates diversity questions into hiring decisions or into collections. Um, so, with without any further ado, I'd like for you folks to maybe introduce yourselves. So, Yakut, would you like to go first?
Sure. And thanks for inviting me to another coffee chat. These are always very rewarding intellectually as well as personally. So thank you. Um, so my name is Yakut Akman. It's a Turkish name for those of you who are wondering. I have about 40 years, a little over 40 years of diverse and global experience in financial services. Most of it is in operations and technology, came through the ranks, and held a number of executive positions, managing operations in first regional, then global roles. I have about a 5 year stint in internal audit and about 15 years in risk management. Um, as a matter of fact, my last role before I retired from Citigroup about a year and a half ago was the chief third party management officer for Citigroup. And in response to a major regulatory criticism, I had the opportunity to lead the efforts to overhaul our company's third party uh, management policies, standards, establish oversight and ongoing monitoring mechanisms, and all in line with compliance with regulatory requirements, which are not easy to do. Uh, so I retired, and I'm currently working in some advisory roles with some private companies, entertaining possibly being on public or private boards if the opportunities come up. In the meantime, I'm on a nonprofit board because I think at this point in my life, I'm giving back. I'm looking forward to uh, giving back to the community and particularly to the younger generation and doing it more and more through coaching, mentoring, and through various channels. Um, and certainly my background, being a female professional coming from a different country, a minority, or have you, lends itself very nicely to help others learn from not just my experiences, but from my mistakes. And ESG topic is really smack in the middle of a number of things that I typically discuss with other folks. So I'm looking forward to having this discussion with Alpa and you, Tim. So that's it.
Awesome. I like how you phrased the opportunity to correct the regulatory concerns. It's always an opportunity.
Yes.
So, Alpa, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. My name is Alpa Inamdar. Really excited to do this coffee chat with my dear friend and a mentor, Yakut. So thank you. Um, a little bit about me. So I've got about 20 plus, 23 plus, given the fact that, Yakut said 40. I'm going to be somewhat cautious now. But 23 plus years experience in the industry, starting from manufacturing. I did a couple of years in food industry, and then ended up in engineering and construction, where I did a lot of aero defense contracts, such as Lockheed and Bechtel. And then last 15 years in the financial industry, including Societe Generale, Goldman Sachs. Regarding my nonprofit or my passion, I'm a big proponent of women helping women. So I have co-founded a program called Global Center for Women in Risk Leadership because I did find that we have a lack of representation women in risk. I've also founded two programs myself, which is Women Helping Women in Finance, which is really helping women who are coming in the financial industry very early on to really understand the political landscape and how to navigate your career, because that was one of the challenges I've had starting my career in the financial industry. And the second program I founded was called Take Two. This is where women and men who have voluntarily left the workforce and wanting to come back in the industry, how do we help them and how does the organization support when they're coming back to that hiatus? I also do sit on the risk board and I'm a shared assessment committee member because third party governance is clearly important to all of us. And given the fact ESG, I also sit on PACE University, the transformation advisory role, as well as New York Parks and Trails, as environment is very important to us. So really excited to do this session with you guys today, and I'll kick it back to you.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us and for being willing to provide your experience and expertise to the topics, because it is a really broad topic, and we're going to go all over the place as part of this conversation. So that's perfectly fine. But to start it and maybe just to frame it a little bit and just sort of to tie it back into the third party risk management side of it, one of the areas that I'm curious about is what you've seen over your careers and as evolved from, like you said, Alpa, from manufacturing in different areas, and Yakut, and you've had a pretty broad experience within the risk management and financial services space. What are the expectations from a third party perspective, right? From a ESG, or more specifically from a diversity or inclusion aspect of things? What is are decisions being made around whether or not to hire vendors? Is it simply, let's go make sure we understand what our profile and landscape looks like? Where does it go from here?
I was still thinking about Alpa's 20 years and how they more than exceed my 40 years in terms of what she's done. So, uh, quite impressive. Having learned so much about looking at third parties um, differently after the experience that I've gone through, uh, one of the things that I have come to realize that even though we always talk about third parties as a separate entity, third parties are truly an extension of whatever operation we have in the company that we work in. Um, so it's almost wrong to think of third parties as sort of an out of body experience, something that exists outside of us. Because what they do really are the kinds of things that we would normally do in house. As a matter of fact, traditionally, we did do in house for many, many years. But now that third parties have emerged and who can do things faster, cheaper, and arguably better than we would, then we outsource activities and services typically and pay them, and then they do it. But we can never outsource our responsibility, right? We're still very much accountable for everything that the third parties do. So, in that sense, everything that we would be holding ourselves accountable for in terms of our policies and standards really apply to third parties as well. The challenge is, how do you oversee third parties doing all those right things in line with your policies and standards? How do you make sure they are really complying with your expectations, if not the role of your requirements? And that's very, very difficult. And it's difficult enough with the typical operational risk items. It is extremely, almost impossible when we talk about the ESG factors. Uh, and I don't think anybody has really solved this puzzle yet. And I will have Alpa comment on these more and more, because I don't know if things have changed since I retired. But based on all the discussions that I have with my colleagues in the industry, it's not really easy. Now, we do put in our contracts and what have you, and typically that's what you do legally. You hold them responsible for complying with all the ESG expectations, all the legal phrases that you can find. You throw them in the document. Um, and then you say, if you don't do it, then these are the penalties, or blah blah blah. But it's not really that easy. One of the things I had suggested in one of the sort of think tank discussions some time ago was, uh, I come from the financial services industry. It's very difficult for a bank to go and kick the tires at a third party and say, "Are you complying with all our ESG expectations?" Um, Similarly, I think we've come to realize that it's very difficult for us to monitor their activities when it comes to accounting requirements or some other operational risk with information security. Da, da, da. So that's why we have SOC 1 and SOC 2 audits. And I even suggested maybe at some point there will be a SOC 3 specifically around ESG requirements, so that somebody else can really go and kick the tires and come up with this report. And then we'll say, okay, we'll put some reliance on those kind of reports. So it's a challenge. Third parties are held accountable. I will say one more thing, that I'll turn it over to Ilpa. Alpa. When I was managing a third-party risk, and we came up with our new policy. There were certain sections that refer to expectations from third parties, very much in line with similar to ESG, like they should comply with diversity, health and human rights, and so on and so forth. And some of the business managers reacted to saying, "How do you expect me to do this? I have to deal with these third parties. This is not a business-wise action that you're forcing on us." And that's when I had my aha moment. I was like, "Wow, really?" Uh, uh, so, but it also made me realize that it's easier said than done. So I don't really have a quick and easy answer to your question. I think this is still evolving, but I think as everybody becomes more aware of these expectations, a lot of these things will develop organically, and they will be complying with these things, and hopefully we'll get to that happy point at some point in time. Alpa, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with you, right? So I just want to make sure for the ESG, environmental social governance. I think EMEA has done a little better job, but if you think about United States, completely aligned with you, Yakut, is we're not there, right? Most of these organizations do not have a standard metrics or reporting that you can actually measure how either yourself as an organization is doing or how your third party vendors are doing, right? So I think that creates a challenge. I think due to the pandemic, ESG, and I think also because of Larry Fink's email like to the CEOs, it has definitely been heightened, right? You've seen it's coming in through the regulators, all the industry, and different aspects of environmental and social governance, right? A lot of people as the organizations are still just trying to, as I call, dissect, right? If we think about environmental factors, the net carbon zero footprint, what does that really mean? Or being green? How do you really measure being green, right? So I think, like Yakut says, we put a lot of our policies and procedures and a legal contractual side. We put these great words, we'll measure you to make sure your ESG is accordingly. But what is that? And how do we make sure that, is 10% green acceptable for next 5 years, or is 10% as a starting point and then you increase by 30%? I think all that data and the metric is still lacking significantly. At the same time, I do think it's extremely important because if we think about risk, and what Yakut said is, in the past, it was more of a checkbox exercise, right? HR kind of sat there and saying you have a diversity and inclusion or equity, and it's done. And now that accountability has to be partnered with business partners. It can't be in isolation. So I think chief compliance officers, chief ethics officers now are going to be more and more accountable, right? For looking and making sure, do we have the right due diligence? Do we have the right governance? Again, with the pure partnership with the businesses. It can't be an extension. It can be, as I call the stepchild, right? It has to be part of the process. And we have a long way to go, but I do think more and more the organizations are now working towards having some kind of standard metrics that should be measured. They are trying to come up with that reporting, but it is going to be an evolution. I think, like I said, we're just barely scratching the surface at this point.
So you both made reference to a very important aspect of this, I think, which is the responsibility factor, right? So it's you can't outsource the responsibility as a company, fundamentally. And so one of the areas or the questions is, one certainly from our experience as somebody doing this work as well, the um, the focus on diversity and inclusion in particular has been around for a while, right? It's been in contracts. It's been something which has been strongly supported by regulations and government and other activities. And that's the one that maybe in some ways is easier to measure, right, within the bounds of data privacy and people's own willingness or desire to expose the information. That's one that's been a little bit easier to measure overall. So what's the in your experiences both, right, doing that internally in a company and saying, here's what our company is trying to do about diversity and inclusion, and then carrying that forward into the third party policy? Have you seen any evolution in that space as well?
We have most organizations right now are looking at Source Diversity Advisory Council, where they work with procurement and all the businesses to make sure that, do we have the diverse suppliers? Are we managing that risk, or do we have too much concentration on one specific geographic region? or one specific product and services where the concentration is all hypothetically in China, for an example. So I think it's where the concentration is, where the location risk is, and then also the products and services that they're offering. Are they diverse in that? So more and more organizations are now asking, how much of the businesses are women owned? How many of them are owned by different nationalities or cultures? So I think we are moving more towards that diversity, like you're talking about. And this is not something new by any means, but I do think because of over time, and especially now within the last year between all the protests, right? People really globally asking for racial diversity and equality in all part of the industry, not just financial. And then having people accountable, I think more and more organizations are now having enough data where they're going in and saying is 60% of our suppliers are based out of here. 30% of those vendors are owned by small businesses and are by X organizations. So I think we're getting more in that more data set. We still need to make sure that the top of the house, because this again, leadership, the views come directly from them and how they manage this whole process. So I think the executives, the leadership team, and then that information trickles down. But I think there's still a long way to go because inherently we do have a tendency to go very similar to what we feel comfortable, right? So if I've done a business with a supplier for 32 years, it's in Idaho and, it's a really good friend of mine for the last 30 years, even though I'm going to an RFP and I have a diverse pipeline, because I have such a great relationship with my friend in Idaho, I'm going to more likely to do that business with them. I think that mindset does need to change. And that I think is, again, it's the organizational culture. And then what we push the agenda or how we drive that change and expect those leaders is, did we look at that diverse slate and how do we hold them accountable?
Yeah, I agree with Alpa. And what I have witnessed over the years is indeed a greater push to hire more diverse suppliers, women owned, minority owned, Black owned businesses. And we indeed increased our ratio from whatever, if we had 10 suppliers, now it was 100 suppliers. But one of the things that my staff would always laugh at me because I would come up with these sayings. And one of my favorite sayings, and Alpa may have heard this before, is if you torture numbers bad enough, they'll confess to anything. So we can take comfort in the fact that, oh, gee, now we used to have 10 suppliers, now we have 100 suppliers and minority of owned businesses. Isn't that great? But if you have 20,000 vendors, that's still a drop in the bucket. So you can twist the numbers any way you want, and companies do that. So when you read their annual reports and what have you, pay attention to exactly how they're phrasing their achievements. It's just amazing how it's not always an apples to apples comparison when they word their accomplishments in one category versus another. But having said that, I don't mean to sound very critical because there has indeed been progress. And again, as people understand the value that these diverse vendors bring, they don't look at it as the nice thing to do. They really see a business value in this, and that's when they will shift to hiring these vendors more and more.
That's a great point, Yakut. So there's been a number of studies talking about the value of diversifying your pipeline and diversifying the supply chain from that side of it. Anything further you want to talk about on that side of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, I know, Yakut, you and I talked about it, but McKinsey and Catalyst, there are a lot of have come up with this data, right? A lot of research done on diversity and inclusion, where I think with the McKinsey one that I know of is saying is if you have a diverse and racial and ethical for workforce, you're 35% more likely to outperform from a financial perspective compared to the national average, right? And that's huge, right? So, I mean, we know that the minute you do have a diverse workforce, you make sure that people have different ideas and innovation. And that only happens with a diverse workforce. So I think it's going to be more and more critical. We're going to see more of it. And you're going to see organizations benefit significantly from all different aspects, not just the financial, but even the risk perspective, because now you'll have people challenging coming from a different backgrounds. And that could be anything, right? It could be your it could be ethnicity, it could be age, it could be your religion, it could be your disabilities. Any of those factors will play a significant role in that diverse decision making.
Yeah, we're sort of shifting from looking at diverse third parties to looking at diversity in house among our own employees. So, if you don't mind, I'll shift to that and build on what Alpa said.
Sure.
I think for the longest time, uh, I certainly have been a part of a number of women's groups meeting together and see how we can help each other get ahead, get promoted, get better raises, and so on and so forth. Uh, and the needle really didn't move much in the last 20, 30 years, very little. No matter which way you cut it, I think the numbers prove me right. Um, because the decision makers continue to be uh, white males, who certainly said all the right things and maybe even meant it to some degree. But at the end of the day, we did not really provide a value proposition to them saying, hey, if you really hire more minorities, more diverse folks, at the end of the day, your businesses will grow. You'll make more money. The revenues will go up, and so on and so forth. Um, so while there was a huge push, I'm sure that to this day this exists in all the organizations to have a diverse slate. The final decision making was still whoever they claim to be the best on that slate. So the same minority names would show up in multiple interview slates. And really, this is going back to now torturing not just numbers but names. And when you look at the makeup of the vast majority of an organization, it's 50-50 male, female at the lower ranks, if not women are a little higher. And then you go up, somehow it's 80-20. What changed along the way? There were some stops where women had to get off or minorities had to get off that men didn't. How did this journey work? I mean, these are all the obvious questions and even answers that we don't need to go into too much detail. But the mindset, I think, has to change by the decision makers because typically men, really businessmen, need to be convinced based on the numbers, the results, and it's there. We just need to help them see it if they haven't seen it before. I was lucky to work with some very high executive level professionals who really did see the value in minorities and women. I certainly had an advocate at some point in my career that helped me a lot, and in return, he was rewarded because I delivered results. So it wasn't like he was nice to me and not good for me. No, it was really a give and take. But anyway, at the end of the day, women really need to work with men, educate them, if I could use that word, and they need to be willing to have an open mind. And at the end, I think if we really partner strongly, much more strongly than we have in the past, then the results will be wonderful, much better than what we've seen before.
No, and I completely agree with you, Yakut, right? It's that allyship, right? You need men in those conversations. It's great to have these women initiatives and women networks, but end of the day, most of the decision makers are male. So if you have that sponsorship or that allyship, more women are going to be successful because one, they're going to understand the women's perspective, but the second is you have those men pouncing on that table for those specific women to get ahead. And that, I think, because of the gap is so significant right now, I think we are closing slowly. We do need that partnership. And I completely agree. I think, we didn't move the needle until we got men involved in these conversations and becoming part of the change.
Exactly.
So you've both referenced that it's not a numbers game, right? At the end of the day, which it may have been considered in some points in the past. Now it's really about saying that the opportunity for a company to be more effective and make more money at the end of the day, and do it more efficiently is what's going to be driving a lot of this capability. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this first part of a two-part episode with Yakut and Alpa. Great insights, great opinions that they've shared overall today, and I hope that you come and see the next episode where they'll continue the conversation and continue the discussion about financial services, diversity, and inclusion as part of our ESG series. Thanks for joining us today. Please join us again on the next episode of Coffee Chat with CastleHill, and have a great day.